In this episode, we don't have any spoilers, so enjoy a spoiler-free one for once. When we think about television show endings, I think we tend to imagine the dramatic final scenes in MASH or the explosion of online debates after the conclusion of Succession. But those conversations don't really apply to all types of television shows. There's some interesting cases of shows that don't end. Or at least haven't yet. In this episode, I'll present 3 vignettes. In the first, we'll talk about the unique case of cartoons and how they have some unique characteristics that sometimes help protect them from endings in ways that live action can't. In the second vignette, we'll discuss the world of reality television. And in the final story, we'll look at worlds that exist outside of a singular TV show, across multiple series where a single show's ending might not impact the world as a whole. Let's start by looking at the first category, animated shows. I think it's pretty obvious why this genre would be more protected than live-action shows. Unlike the producers of Stranger Things, animators don't have to worry about Bart Simpson or Tina Belcher aging out of their roles. An animated character never has to age, even as the actor voicing them does.
I mean, Bart's been 12 for 35 years.
This is Mark Hampton, a screenwriter in Los Angeles.
So it's like, what could they possibly cover in an ending that would matter for the show, because they're so self-contained. It's just episode by episode. I think it'll matter in terms of like the fact it's iconic and that it would be off the air.
Speaking here about The Simpsons, I would agree with Mark's assessment that animated shows tend to be very self-contained, especially American animated series like Family Guy or Bob's Burgers, or my personal favorite, King of the Hill, for its very Texan sense of place and humor. These animated shows tend to be joke-heavy, pop culture referencing, and almost never rely on story arcs spanning across a season. When that's the case, does the show's ending really matter?
Simpsons, I think it will matter only because it's such a massive milestone that show would go off the air after how long it would be on. But narratively and creatively, if you haven't gotten enough Simpsons by now, I don't think you ever will.
It's not like we need to wrap up a big plot or complete a character's journey. Each episode can stand on its own as a fun little romp, where fundamentally nothing changes. In contrast to this very American example, Japanese anime can also have shows that seem to run for decades on decades, but with more of an overarching plot across the seasons. Common examples would be Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Inuyasha, Naruto, and One Piece. Even the shorter-running animes tend to have a clearly defined story arc. Ouran Host Club or Full Metal Alchemist each were relatively short and had a clear end goal in mind. Man, are all my anime references old? Am I dating myself? But for the anime series that do seem to last forever, especially those in the shonen category, which is aimed primarily at a young male audience, you often see issues related to what's called power creep. In combat-based storylines, you often have characters trying to level up and develop new skills or powers to defeat the big bad. This gives you a sense of purpose and a goal for that character. But it also means you have characters who are constantly scaling up their fighting abilities against enemies who are doing the same thing. If Season 1 had the fate of the world in the balance, how do you continue to up those stakes to match the character's ever-growing powers? It makes sense for characters to grow and get stronger, but if it's an ever-climbing trajectory of new powers and new strengths, eventually it'll feel unrealistic to the watcher. You might even run out of ways to make the next battle bigger. I personally think the show Bleach was particularly bad about this. I loved the early seasons, but eventually the overpowered sword fights just felt ridiculous instead of epic. So, American animated series may have lower stakes for their endings, while Japanese anime shows might be forced to conclude due to power creep. But in both cases, their worlds are typically free to continue indefinitely as long as the audience is still there and interested. But what about the secondary category of forever shows that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast? What about reality TV? Now, I have been known to have questionable television taste according to some, but I have always attempted to defend myself by saying, at least I don't watch reality TV. I've never really gotten into the drama of Botoxed housewives, the lives of the rich and famous, or even competition shows that pit regular people against each other for the chance to win a boatload of money. But although I used to brag about not liking reality TV as if it were a class marker, it's become increasingly clear that I'm the odd one out. According to Civic Science, a polling company that surveys U.S. teens and adults, 52% of U.S. adults admit that they watch at least 1 hour of reality TV per week. And adults aged 18 to 34 are more likely to watch reality TV than those who are 35 or older. Thankfully, I have a friend who was happy to fill in my educational gaps when it came to reality TV. Or at least to one show in particular.
Hey, I'm Maggie O'Connor, and I'm obsessed with Survivor.
This was one of the first things I learned about Maggie. Not because she led with it, but because my husband was trying to make fun of my supernatural obsession to her and her husband when we were out to dinner. Turns out that backfired because she has an equally intense love for a television show. Just a horse of a different color.
One way that's growing in popularity right now is the LRG community, which is live reality games. So people will attend these like weekends or week-long games where they're playing against other just normal people, and the production team is just a nonprofit team that loves Survivor and puts on this incredible experience that you wouldn't be able to get unless you go on the show. So that's another huge way that people are kind of participating in the fandom now.
Maggie and her husband, Brian, started their own version of a Survivor competition that they run with their friends. Just like in the television show, they recruit friends to compete in a series of challenges with all the typical trappings of the show. Immunity challenges, tribal councils, and dramatic jury scenes, voting off competitors of the game. But as the game masters and videographers, Maggie and Brian are too busy running the game to actually get to play themselves.
Since we started our LRG, we have been really into assessing different challenges and seeing how different challenges work at different points in the season, or different types of rewards, whether that's like a group reward or individual immunity, which is so important in the game. My husband found a resource that has spliced out all of the Survivor music from any other audio. So there are these resources on the web that like help people really dive in to that world. And we put out full seasons of these weekends that we put on. So, and then we have our watch parties, and it's a lot of fun and it's a lot of work, and it's probably more of a psychosis than a hobby, but we love it.
That's right. I might have started a podcast based on my passion for Supernatural, but Maggie and her husband run an entire mini Survivor competition, which they film and edit and then screen for their friends. And Daniel thinks I'm intense. All teasing aside, I was curious why Maggie got hooked on this particular show.
I grew up thinking reality television was absolute trash. And it wasn't until 5 years ago when my now husband's ex-roommate got us into Survivor, because that roommate is best friends with Daniel Strunk, who is actually on season 43, I believe, and flamed out in such incredible fashion. But that sort of Survivor niche entered our life through my husband's friend, and I just never turned back.
It's not just that it was a reality TV show and she was already hooked on the genre. It was very much about the specific premise of Survivor.
Survivor is, I think, the purest form of reality television. What it does is it strips everything away from a person. It strips comfort, it strips family, it just everything that we rely on in life as our security blankets. It takes that away and forces people to interact with each other, and the full spectrum of interacting. You have to rely on other people to survive. You have to rely on other people's word that they aren't going to vote you out. You have to build some kind of connection because you aren't talking to your family or friends for a full month and a half. And in that way, it is the purest game.
That's not to say that all of Survivor is a perfect show.
There were 4 seasons that I absolutely couldn't get through because the people were just horrible human beings. You take away their comfort and they go at it. One season, somebody throws someone's prosthetic leg in a fire. Another season, somebody calls someone worthless because she was adopted and nobody wanted her. Trash behavior.
Like any long-running production, there are seasons that don't hit the mark. And considering the show started in 2000, some basic standards for behavior and contestant safety took a while to be codified. Now, though, the show is a well-oiled machine, churning out new seasons and new players for watchers to root for. And, like a genre television show, Survivor has a unique relationship with its fans.
The fact that there are so many players means that they are honestly more accessible. In order to stay in the limelight, they really engage with people on social media and on Reddit. So that's one way that people kind of connect with the casts of Survivor. Another weird way is, I believe it's Wendell of Ghost Island, sells tickets to these parties where Survivor players attend. And so you get to just hang out with Survivor players. So they do things to try to monetize their 15 minutes in the sun. Cameos are huge.
Survivor cons, anyone? Okay, so Maggie has sold me on the idea that Survivor is just as fun to watch as Supernatural, at least for the right audience, and that the fandom is heavily engaged. But with over 40 seasons, I had to ask, would it matter if the show ended?
If it were the last season of Survivor, people would lose their shit. Because the thing is that there are people that have applied over a dozen times to be on the show. And so people are constantly hoping, okay, maybe it's next time. Maybe I'll get on for this one specific type of season that I'm a perfect fit. And that's something that's really engaging the audience, this idea of participation. So I think that group would just lose their minds. The issue with Survivor is that it is so wrapped up with Jeff Probst.
As a non-fan of Survivor, I couldn't even tell you who Jeff is, let alone pick him out of a lineup. But apparently a major part of what makes Survivor Survivor is him.
He is clearly the heart and soul of the show. And when he ages out of being able to host, a lot of people are nervous that no one could fill those shoes. So people are curious what their strategy is, if they'll bring in a second host to potentially ease that transition at some point. But right now, there's no sign of Jeff going anywhere.
It seems there's still plenty of interest in Survivor, and Jeff is still fit and raring to do a new season. So my guess is we won't know what the Survivor fandom will look like post-show for quite a long time. But is Survivor unique? Or do many reality TV shows and reality competitions in particular have this same fandom intensity? Meet Katie Hampton.
I am an unemployed actress, and I also work in reality TV and a bunch of different things. Basically, anything that's going on strike, that's where I work.
We recorded this interview in March, right as IATSE was preparing to strike. For reference, IATSE stands for the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees and includes behind-the-scene workers of all sorts. Katie works behind the scenes of a show you might have heard of.
So I work on The Amazing Race, and those fandoms I'm shocked by because I never watched an episode of The Amazing Race until I started working on it. And, and I was so impressed by some of like the contest, like people will run their own amazing races in their hometowns. They will do all like their audition tapes are gloriously cute. They're very into it. They know all the lore. They know when like rules have changed. They like the lead host, Phil, they like all they want is just to get on the mat and meet Phil. And I was like, who is Phil?
Phil, as you may have guessed, is Phil Keegan, the host of The Amazing Race. Phil and Jeff, the unknown stars of reality TV, apparently. But just like Survivor, The Amazing Race has its hardcore fans.
It's amazing how deep that fandom goes and how much people want to know. Like, and I very rarely talk about it when I'm like out with my husband because we both work on the show. And when we happen to just say that, oh, we work on a reality show at a bar or something like that, people always ask what, and we're like, oh, like what are you watching? Like we try and switch the subject because as soon as we say, oh, it's like a show called Amazing Race, I don't know if you've heard of it, and everyone in there, and they're like, well, how do you get on?
Katie works on the crew for The Amazing Race, and we talked about how the producers think about crafting stories and drama for reality TV. Since the contestants aren't actors, knowing how to slot people into character arcs and create stories is a unique challenge. One that they usually address with the direct-to-camera interviews that are cut between the challenges.
And I think that's something that reality TV does employ is a more episodic feeling where you can kind of understand sort of the tropes of different characters and how producers really bring that out in certain people. Like there are many things, at least on the production side, where people cater sort of a story. And that's usually the story department is usually where I'm in, where they cater based on the interviews, based on the people, based on their personality, what character they fit into so that they can be episodic.
Reality TV is almost created backwards from scripted television because instead you start with the characters and work backwards to create the story with its heroes and villains.
They ask very direct questions to make them speak like that, so that they have that footage and then they cater the story to that story. Yeah, I think reality TV is definitely one of those things that it is cheap to make, it is cheap to produce, it's very quick turnaround, and it kind of appeals to sort of our most basic nature.
Katie, like Maggie, said that the show really hinges on the host and the tone that they set.
I think because you have those tent poles of your hosts, you have those tent poles of those rules. The things that change are the locations, the people, the contestants, and things like that. I think that is the stuff that like people come to have the comfort in of recognizing, of knowing. So if the host changed, it would have to be, honestly, they would have to slow roll it in or they'd have to slow roll it out, and you'd have to find someone that like you'd really like.
Looking beyond Survivor and The Amazing Race, we've seen shows changing new hosts kill a fan following before.
Take a look at the show Wipeout. It's now hosted by Nicole Byer and John Cena, an incredible duo. that show got canceled. I mean, it got reborn, but the original hosts were the things that people really loved because they came from MTV generation. Like it was one of those things where the host like really made the show, and the obstacle courses changed and the stuff became more ridiculous. All that stuff, the people changed obviously for the contestants, but it didn't survive. And I'm wondering if it's because that familiarity of the host, the style of the host, or like the comfort of just seeing that person's face and that person's voice was the thing that kept them coming back.
I was certain that reality TV was somehow immune to the hazards of endings and extreme emotional reactions they can elicit. But I guess any show that builds a vibrant enough fandom will have a strong reaction to that show's conclusion, regardless of format. Okay, but I have one more example to share. What about shows that are part of a broader world? Sure, an individual show may end, but in some of these cases, the fictional world lives on, and you still might see your favorite characters pop in from time to time. My core example, in case you couldn't guess, is Star Trek. The original series only lasted 3 seasons, but in the intervening decades, there have been many more new enterprises, and even a Discovery and Voyager thrown into the mix. Each series has a new captain and crew, and they often explore different eras of Starfleet, from the formative years shown in Star Trek Enterprise to the post-apocalyptic world of Star Trek Discovery. We may have thought that with the end of Star Trek: The Next Generation, that was the last we'd see of Picard. Well, besides the many movie appearances. But give it a couple decades, and the new series, Picard, brought back the whole crew, a bit older and with a different tone. We even have an animated corner of the universe with my current favorite, Lower Decks.
Lower Decks, that continues the fandom in a way that is really unique and really fun, and something I never thought Star Trek would do. I was as a huge Star Trek fan, talk about fandom, I was very skeptical, and now it is easily my favorite.
This is, once again, screenwriter Mark Hampton.
Such a love letter to Star Trek, and you could tell it is written with absolute love. It's like those old letters like Hemingway would write. It's like that's how much love is in each of those episodes, So great way to continue fandom there.
Lower Decks is also able to take advantage of being an animated show, which means that actors can return to previous roles, still appearing in the same animated version of their character, despite decades that have elapsed since they last played that character.
Talk about a universe that continues. You get to see, like, they went to Voyager. You get to see a lot of Easter eggs from Voyager. They went to Deep Space Nine. You saw Quark and Major Kira, whom I adored. I just absolutely adored. And it was like, you're not going to see the Deep Space Nine characters pop up in like their own spin-offs. Like, it just wasn't popular enough. It was well received and a critical darling, but it just wasn't the most popular Star Trek show. Lower Decks is the perfect opportunity to bring any of these people back.
Star Trek isn't the only universe who brings back characters again and again. Here's researcher Rebecca Williams.
Again, if you look at the sort of Star Wars stuff as well, even if the characters that are long dead, actually, because so many of them are prequels and they jump around in the story kind of universe a lot. So actually, yeah, your favorite thing might finish, but yeah, Star Wars universe keeps going. And I think the other thing with that is that there is always then that chance that it might come back.
This can be really fun for fans to know they still might get to see a favorite character pop up on a new show unexpectedly. But for some, this also means that they feel like they have to watch every new series that drops. What if something big or important happens? Better watch that whole new miniseries, and quick, before someone spoils it for you.
It was really intense for fans, I think, and then it's done. And it's like, okay, what's the next thing? Because, Disney have always got a new Star Wars thing or a new Marvel thing dropping. So it's always, I think fans feel a bit that you can't just sort of stop and enjoy something, and you can't catch your breath because the next thing is going to come and that'll be the next thing that you have to binge.
There's nothing wrong with indulging in a TV binge every now and again, but it can get exhausting when you feel obligated to.
But yeah, there is only so much you can keep up with. And I think it asks a lot of fans to sort of know everything that's happening across all of this stuff. Because if you watch it all, there's so many hundreds and hundreds of hours.
Do you want to guess how many hours of Star Wars content there is on Disney Plus? It's a fun fact. You have a number in mind? Was it around 8 days? And I thought the extended edition of Lord of the Rings was long. But back to task. Some long-running fictional universes have more flexibility or freedom to pick up or drop without needing to consume every single episode in the series.
I think about something like Doctor Who, which is my fandom.
Paul Booth, the DePaul professor who we've heard from several times over the course of this series, is a huge fan of the BBC series that first aired in 1963.
That's the thing that I am the biggest fan of. And you've got all these kind of textually created divisions in the fandom. So people that are fans of particular doctors, people that are fans of particular showrunners, particular eras, like classic series, new series, or, fans who grew up at different times.
For the Doctor Who uninitiated, Doctor Who is a science fiction television series following an alien character called the Doctor, who travels through space and time in his ship, which looks kind of like a blue phone booth, and is called the TARDIS. Originally played by the grandfatherly William Hartnell, this first version of the Doctor lasted 3 seasons before failing health forced Hartnell to leave the show. To keep the show on the air, they employed the idea of regeneration, where the Doctor's species, Time Lords, could regenerate into a new form, and therefore a new actor. This clever in-universe writing has allowed the show to remain on the air till this day. That's not to say there haven't been periods where the show went dormant. Technically, one show ends when a doctor regenerates into a new form, often with a new showrunner and writer's room changing over at the same time, even when the core premise carries on. But unlike Star Trek, which has multiple shows and some of them running concurrently, there's only one show called Doctor Who. And an actor playing the Doctor might just last one season, or series in British, or they might stick around for multiple.
There are people who grew up in the kind of 90s and became a Doctor Who fan when there wasn't a Doctor Who on the air, right? Because there was a period where it wasn't on the air. And for those fans, see Doctor Who very differently than fans who grew up in the classic series or fans who grew up in the new series, because for them, Doctor Who was always this kind of thing that they couldn't access. They could only read about it. It was almost like the Romans or a Greek culture, like you could only access it through research. And so it's a very different way to experience a text than now, when you can watch every single episode and stream it, or back in the 60s and 70s where you could watch an episode once and then it was never on again. So the way that fans approach a media text is going to affect what they think that text is. And that's going to affect whether or not they agree on an ending.
Speaking of versions of characters and endings that don't really end, we're sort of missing a really obvious example, aren't we? We might only think of the Robert Downey Jr. version of Iron Man now, but historically speaking, that basically makes no sense. Until the Disney juggernaut of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, fans' relationships to comics have generally been more closely aligned to the DC style. Like, how many Batmans can you name? During my conversation with Fansplaining's co-host Elizabeth Minkle, I learned that she isn't that big into comic books, even though she finds them interesting in other ways.
I think between some of the various eras of these comics, right? Because you get like totally different writers with like different politics and like different vibes and thinking about audiences differently and all that. And one thing I find really interesting about them is their audience's willingness to kind of just reset everything constantly in a way that I think the same audiences doesn't translate over into any other medium. I think that comics are interesting in that way, in the sense of like, if you look at the history of some of them too, right? Like, that title might go dormant for a while and then they pick it back up. This kind of idea that like these characters always sort of exist, right? And they always could be picked up again and they always could be reimagined.
In case you couldn't tell, this episode was different from previous ones in that I wanted to explore things that don't end. Except for they do. Maybe not in the ways we expect, but there's still many endings to each example we explored. Like, the wildly popular TV show Survivor hasn't hit their final season yet. But each season ends with their unique cast of competitors and new challenges culminating in a single winner beating out the competition. Sure, there's another group of contestants and a new set of challenges, but that particular story arc of the season finds a resolution. And a regeneration of the Doctor isn't an ending of the show Doctor Who, but it is the ending for that particular version of the character. Shows like The Simpsons are really the only true break in this pattern, as a show that doesn't care for season-long arcs that conclude, and being protected by a strong legacy and the relatively cheap production costs of animated shows, I honestly don't know what an ending for that show would even look like. Well, we knew going into this there are no easy answers to be had about television endings. Next time on In Defense of Fandom, we do exactly what my husband feared this whole season would be about. We dig deep on Supernatural's finale and the many, many strong feelings it elicited. Special guest Lynn Zabernis will be joining me for a structured conversation all about the last season and the last 3 episodes of Supernatural in particular. So if you have any burning thoughts or feelings you want to share on that topic, now's your last chance to send them my way. See you in 2 weeks. Editorial support was provided by Dr. Anna Funk. Music was composed and performed by Chris Scott. Cover art was designed by Liz Hand. In Defense of Fandom was made possible through an unhealthy obsession and your support via Ko-fi. Thanks especially to Meg B, Catalanta, and Tiff for supporting this season of the pod. If you're not already supporting the show and you'd like to, you can find a link in the show notes to our Ko-fi. A one-time donation of any amount will get you access to behind-the-scenes content, including the audio of my full conversations with this season's guests. And if you can't support the show financially, giving it a review on Apple Podcast is a great way to help support this work. Your support is deeply appreciated.